Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for June 27th, 2022. As we reported last week, there have been indications, in fact warnings from British networks of the inability of the West to provide the necessary level of ammunition and weapons because of the collapse of industrial production that are needed to win the war in Ukraine. There have been several who have said it's impossible for Britain's war industry to provide that level, the level they believe is necessary. And this is the result of neoliberal economics, of the emphasis on money, that you can make money through speculation so you don't need to invest in costly areas of industrial production, combined with a green policy, which basically says we shouldn't be producing anything. Now, this flies in the face of the demands for the British and the West, NATO and the United States, to escalate the war against Russia. You have the new chief of the British Army, General Sir Patrick Sanders, who last week told the troops, quote, "There is now a burning imperative to fight in Europe once again, to forge an army capable of fighting alongside our allies and defeating Russia in battle," unquote. This is completely delusional. The British Army is downsizing. The British economy is in deep trouble. Not only that, but the whole war effort is on the verge of collapse with recent developments in the Donbass. We have commentary from retired Colonel Richard Black to the Schiller Institute, which has gone viral in many languages. Others, such as Lieutenant Colonel Douglas McGregor, Scott Ritter, who are making the point that Ukraine has lost. Ritter, in a recent Consortium news article, said the ugly truth about Ukraine is, quote, "The longer the war continues, the more Ukrainians will die and the weaker NATO will become," unquote. That isn't stopping the officials in the West, the US, NATO, the European community, to pushing ahead with the idea of more arms and economic warfare will be a solution. But then you put that up against the comments, these warnings I told you about, and I've already reported this, but I'm going to bring it up again because it's urgent that people understand the insanity of the pro-war faction. Lieutenant Colonel retired Vershinin had an article published by RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute, which is the top British defense think tank. Vershinin wrote, quote, "A country must either have the manufacturing capability to build massive quantities of ammunition or have other manufacturing industries that can rapidly be converted to ammunition production. Unfortunately," he concluded, "the West no longer seems to have either," unquote. This was echoed by the chief of the defense staff in Britain, Admiral Sir Tony Ratigan, who said with the existing decline levels in industrial capacity, it could take, quote, 5 to 10 years to deploy a properly armed division, unquote. Well, this is the reality. The NATO countries are running out of ammunition to send to Ukraine. The estimates are that the United States has already used up over a year's worth of manufacturing capability so far. And in the meantime, we're seeing the retreat of Ukraine's forces in the Donbass. Maybe people remember during the Vietnam War, the debate, guns or butter. Well, have you seen the price of butter these days? Now, at the time of the Vietnam War, the U.S. economy still deployed more than half its workforce in productive activity and in the transportation of goods. But even so, with the war investment in Vietnam, inflation occurred. There was a global effect of this, and it ultimately ended up with Nixon taking the dollar off the gold reserve standard and breaking the Bretton Woods system, just as LaRouche had forecast it would. And after Nixon did that, LaRouche forecast that this would forever transform the U.S. economy from a physically productive economy into a speculative casino economy. Now, LaRouche's advice at the time was instead emphasize investment in scientific research and development, in advancing platforms of infrastructure, and in those things which develop the productivity of the labor force, education, standard of living, healthcare, and so on. He proposed in the late 70s an idea which was later adopted in March 1983 by Reagan to move to the Strategic Defense Initiative as an anti-missile defense system, which would have two immediate effects. One is that it would move us away from the dangerous mutual and assured destruction nuclear doctrine, which had been in place since the 50s. But even more importantly, it would bring an introduction of the scientific new physical principles, which could be deployed to upgrade and advance the productivity of all industrial processes. This would have worked, and Reagan's 1983 announcement created the potential for that. But at the same time, as he was discussing this, LaRouche made a couple of forecasts about what happens if you don't do this. He said that while the Soviets could match what the U.S. is doing in the military sector with the Strategic Defense Initiative, he asked, can they enjoy the same rate of economic growth in the economy as a result of civilian economic spin-offs, unquote. That was in April 1983, after the SDI announcement. But he had warned earlier, before Reagan's announcement, in February 1983, he warned Soviet officials that the Soviet economy would collapse in about 5 years if they rejected the policy of Reagan. Well, that's exactly what happened. It was then on October 12, 1988, in a press conference in Berlin, that LaRouche warned that we were then on the verge of the breakup of the Soviet economic system, which no one else had been forecasting. So he forecasted in 83, again in 88, and it happened in the 1989 to 91 period. Now, further, he warned, if we in the West stick to the post-August 15, 1971 policies of the so-called social paradigm shift, our situation would be hopeless. And that's what we're seeing today. The G7, the Group of Seven, is meeting in Germany. They're going to paper over their disagreements, and there are many disagreements. But they're whistling past the graveyard if they think they can generate an economic recovery based on a war production buildup. What's happening in the Western world shows the opposite. There are strikes and protests throughout Western Europe. There's a polarization and political paralysis in the United States. There's inflation. There's supply shortages. There's shortages of skilled labor. And you're going to have a war buildup under these circumstances? Now, the G7, or the European Union, I should say, pledged to come up with $600 billion to counter the effect of China's Belt and Road Initiative. Where's that money going to come from? And more importantly, where's it going to go? It's not going to go into the development of new physical principles, which will increase the productivity of the entire productive process. It's going to go into those areas of economics which degrade physical productivity, such as so-called sustainable energy sources, which cannot provide the level of energy needed in the coming period. In fact, we're already seeing the German government forecasting the need for an emergency, which would include rationing, which would include quadrupling of prices and so on, because of the economic warfare sanctions against Russia. Now, in this circumstance, what we need is realism. We need advanced thinking of statecraft. And that's what was behind the reason for Helga Zepp-LaRouche to issue a call for a new Bretton Woods conference, to address the need to put this bankrupt system into bankruptcy reorganization and begin a process of mutual collaboration for real economic development of the physical economy. That's what was discussed at the BRICS conference, where Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa were joined by several other countries, discussing the possibility of establishing a new financial system that would make its primary concern investing in physical goods production. China's Global Times, in a coverage of this, said, quote, "The world has once again come to the crossroads. Peace or war, development or decline, opening up or closing, cooperation or confrontation," unquote. A bankruptcy reorganization would focus on shutting down the speculative financial systems, putting the banks and their corporate allies through bankruptcy reorganization, and it would be dependent on breaking away from the neoliberal monetarist policies, which emphasize making a paper profit over investment in physical production. Over the next couple of days, I'll have more reports on these summits that are underway. We have the G7 going now, NATO coming up at the end of the week. And then on July 3rd, the LaRouche organization will have a special conference online on what is the real tradition, what are the real principles behind the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776, and how can those principles be realized today by a cooperation among all sovereign nations in the world. It's not the Great Reset, it's not the Green New Deal, it's the emphasis on physical economy that was at the heart of Lyndon LaRouche's work over the last 50 years. So stick with us this week. We'll be posting soon the call for the new Bretton Woods conference. We want it circulated widely, including by you. And we want you also to make sure that people are brought into this fight, because the consequences of not doing what we're calling for are unimaginable. Thanks for joining me. See you tomorrow.